Hi, history lovers. So I am in South Haven, Michigan at the beautiful historic Hotel Nichols, established approximately 1884. It is a family-run, essentially it is a hotel, but a bed and breakfast. Really, it feels like you're in a home. It's like a boutique hotel, and so I'm in sort of the workspace area and just doing some work, and wanted to give you an update about last night's performance for the South Haven Theater Series. We did Rendezvous with Rachel Revere, had about 200 people in attendance, which was wonderful to see. So many folks coming out to learn the history of Boston in the midst of the start of an American Revolutionary War. And even though the Reveres are a name we can attach ourselves to, it was a very common story for families in Boston, which was under siege, meaning it was blockaded. Movements were being controlled by the British regulars, soldiers going in and out of Boston, and there were restrictions on leaving your home in the evening, couldn't leave your house after sundown. There were restrictions on gathering in groups, so town meetings, even worship services, stopping on the street to talk to your neighbor was prohibited, all because it was an intent for conspiracy to commit treason. Port closures, as well as quartering act, meaning soldiers were actually being boarded in inhabitants, citizens' homes, or at that time we weren't citizens, we were subjects of the King George III. So I always utilize volunteers from the audience for our performances, but Rachel Revere, that program is very much an emphasis on audience involvement. Of course, Rachel, at the time that the war began, had 6 children from Paul's first marriage and a newborn baby of her own, and so we are able to utilize the audience to inhabit those children. They're sort of voluntold into the act. And then there are 2 volunteers that are actually sort of plants, as you might say, where I discuss with them the logistics of what they'll be doing in advance to the start of the performance. And so one of those is Paul Revere's son, Paul Revere. And he's a glorious man, looked like Santa Claus, and in fact told me that he does actually do Santa Claus portrayals in the holiday time. So now that's the 4th Santa Claus that I personally know. And and so he was a really, really good Paul Jr., Paul Revere's son. And as I was speaking to him, he reads a PS, a postscript that Paul actually wrote to his son in 1775, in the weeks following the start of the war. But as I was speaking to him in the performance as Rachel Revere, speaking to him as my son, giving him instructions on what to do, because Paul actually requested that his son stay in Boston while the Reveres were getting themselves situated out of town. Of course, they were refugees. Once you left Boston, you couldn't come back. It was essentially controlled by the British. And it was a war zone. Charlestown was going to be burned to the ground in about a month, in June 17th. So it was really important that the Reveres find a way to rendezvous outside of Boston in May. But I drive home the fact that Paul's son stayed behind, at least for some time. And he was in charge of ensuring that the silver shop on Boston Harbor was safe, because once you left your home, the British soldiers would often loot your home. And they could lose maybe whatever they left behind in the house they were willing to part with, but the tools in the silver shop were priceless. And that's because it was not only Paul Revere's tools, it was Paul Revere's father's tools. And Paul Revere's father, he was 13 when he came to Boston by himself, at the age of 13, from France, all by himself. And he was an indentured servant, meaning he learned a skill for 7 years, apprenticed to a master silversmith, and then he became a master in the industry himself and started his own business. Firstborn son Paul Revere became our founding father, master silversmith, and the next Paul also worked as a silversmith, and then the sons thereafter actually went into business with their father to work with copper and brass. The Revere and Sons Copper and Brass Company was Revere and his son, Joseph Warren Revere. So there's an incredible line of generational tool wealth, let's call it. And as I was talking about these tools, I'm like, this is 3 generations of tools. Your grandfather, your father, and now you. We can't lose it. You have to go and see Mr. Isaac Clemens was a former apprentice of the Reveres, and get him to help, because Clemens was going to stay behind in Boston. He was a loyalist, so obviously there were some political divides, but that should never, ever, 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 make you cruel to one another. Case closed. Never forget what a good person has done for you, even in a bad time. And Mr. Isaac Clemens was a really good apprentice of the Reveres, was a very helpful, loyal friend. And so Rachel Revere, instructs her stepson, to go get the help of Mr. Clemens. And as I'm giving this information to this audience member, his eyes start watering so heavily. And I'm like, this guy's really in it. Like, he's really upset that we're leaving him behind. He's really upset that he's like a 14-year-old guy who's now like the man of the house, and he's got to run the whole business and keep track of everything. I'm like, this is really getting to him. Turns out he came to me after the performance. And this gentleman, he said, thank you so much. He said, I was almost uncontrollably emotional because my whole career, I had all of the tools that I used in my career. And he goes, and I traveled all the time. I left my family all the time. I worked in Bali. I worked in and started naming all of these very exotic places. Peru. I didn't quite get what industry he was in. But he said, and the tools that I used in my work, I had inherited from my father. And it was like when he passed away, his tools was what I felt was keeping me close to him. And I can't tell you, this is probably like the 10th time I have selected an audience member who's had an actual close personal connection to the content without knowing them in advance. I'm just attracted to the right people. So that's why I like you.